Okay, so when I was studying at high school and when I was studying at university, my studying at university was a good 50% more efficient than when I was studying at high school, meaning at university, I only had to study half as much than when I was studying at high school. But I was retaining the same amount of information. I was retaining a lot more information actually. And that's because I was studying smarter. I was using some incredibly powerful memory strategies to be able to memorize information in a far shorter time. And in this video, I'm gonna go through those specific strategies. So if you implement them into your studying, like it did with me, they should be able to reduce your studying time by a considerable amount. And these memory hacks that I'm gonna talk about in this video, they were just one way that I was able to study smarter and graduate with a 4.0 GPA. If you want to learn in depth about the full strategy from A to Z on how I graduated in the top 5% of my university, you can check out the Transform Your Grades in 30 Days challenge. There's a link below. It's a 30-day challenge where every day I go through with you step by step how to take your studying to the next level with video lessons, a workbook, productivity planner, quizzes, a private community, and even one-on-one coaching from me. And we're offering a 50% promotional offer. You can check it out in the description below. The Method of Loci. The Method of Loci memorization technique is a way of memorizing material using the visualization of familiar environments in order to better recall the information. So for example, you might imagine yourself placing items around the room, such as the sofa next to your bed, on top of the TV, and then in order to recall each item, you visualize yourself walking back through the room and then either picking up or passing each item that you place there. And that's what triggers your recall for the material you're learning. The Method of Loci is so effective, it's been used by thousands of years. Even the ancient Greeks and Romans were known to have used this strategy. It's a really well documented memory strategy. So in 1966, British historian Frances Yates wrote in her book, The Art of Memory, how she would use a street that she's familiar with, like the street that she lives at, and she'd memorize each building. Then when she needed to remember a list of words or a lot of faces or a series of numbers, she would, in her imagination, walk through the street and place each item that she needed to remember on each building. So in order to retrieve that information at a later date, she would imagine walking through that street again and pick up the items that she put on each building. This strategy is so effective, in fact, that many of the winners of the World Memory Championships use it as their main memory strategy. But I mean, they really take it to the next level. So for example, the 2006 World Memory Champion Clemens Mayer used a 300-point long journey through his house for his world record memorizing 10,040 random digits in 30 minutes. And world record holder Gary Shang has used the Method of Loci to memorize pi to over 65,000 digits. So if these guys are literally memorizing a list of 65,000 numbers using the Method of Loci to help them with memorization, then I'm sure it's good enough to help you memorize your study material. The chain method. The chain method is basically where you have a list of things that you need to remember and you link them all together in some way. So let's say you have a shopping list that you need to remember. That is, you need to buy dog food, cereal, milk, and a newspaper. So using the chain method, you could imagine a kind of cartoon-like story where you forget to buy the food. So you invite your dog up to the table where he eats his cereal and milk with a bowl and spoon, just like a human, while reading a newspaper. So now you're far less likely to forget anything on the list because you've turned what was at the beginning just a boring static list to an interesting story or event. There is one main factor that makes this strategy really good for memorizing revision material, and that's to remember any new piece of information, it must be associated with a ridiculous story. So the more ridiculous you make the story, the easier it will be to remember. And there are 4 ways that you can make your story extremely ridiculous. Substitution. You imagine one item instead of the other. So for example, in the earlier example that we used, we were imagining a dog sitting at a table eating cereal with a bowl and spoon, just like a human would, right? So we're substituting a human with a dog. A human eating at the dinner table is normal, right? But a dog eating at the dinner table is weird. So animals could be talking, inanimate objects could be moving by themselves. The possibilities are only limited by your imagination. Proportion. Try to see the items larger or smaller than reality. So with our story with the dog at the dinner table, if it's a small dog, you could imagine that same dog is the same size as a human, just to make it seem that little bit more weirder and more memorable. Exaggeration. This is where you think of quantities larger than normal. So you could imagine your whole kitchen flooded 2 foot high with cereal and milk. And that's a memorable thought, right? Action. So something in your story needs to be doing something that it wouldn't normally do in real life. So in my story, the dog was sitting at the dinner table, eating cereal and reading the newspaper. Actions are always easier to remember, so applying one or more of these rules to any picture will help you make that picture ridiculous. After some practice, you won't have to think about these rules as you'll be able to do it automatically. And in case you need more examples or you want to learn more about this technique, consider checking out the memory book by Harry Lorraine and Jerry Lucas, because they go into it in far more detail than I possibly could. The dual thinking method. So Thomas Edison would sit upright in his chair with a handful of marbles, and he'd think about a problem and really concentrate hard on it, and eventually he would get tired and start to fall asleep. And as soon as he started to fall asleep, naturally he would let go of the marbles and they would fall on the hard floor, making a lot of noises, therefore waking him up immediately. And at that very moment, he would write down exactly what was on his mind just before he started to drift off. So what Edison was taking advantage of was dual thinking. So there are two ways in which we think. Focused thinking, which is pretty straightforward. It's when we're really concentrating on something, maybe trying to work out a maths equation or problem solving in some way. And then there's diffuse thinking. And this is when you let your mind wander freely, making connections at random and connecting the dots across different things. The idea here is that when your mind is more relaxed, you're able to form more creative solutions to a problem or finally link ideas that have been eluding you earlier. Of course, both of these ways of thinking have their own advantages and disadvantages, but I think both are equally important. But focused thinking is good for when you want to pay attention to details and get intensive work done, whereas diffuse thinking is activated when you're relaxed and not really focusing on anything particular. So it's important to utilize both focused and diffuse thinking when studying. Our brain needs to use diffused mode to connect the dots and focus mode to get things done faster. So for example, I use diffuse thinking when I'm in the shower. I've had so many really good ideas pop up in the shower, so then I have to reach out and grab my phone to write them down before I forget. Another way of using diffuse thinking is if you're sitting and studying for an exam tomorrow with laser sharp focus, and then you take a break for a minute or two, you walk around, you don't touch your phone, and just think about what you studied from a bird's eye view. The Immersion Technique. The Immersion Technique is such an underutilized memory strategy that I think more students should really take advantage of, because it's used quite often when it comes to language learning. So if you're learning, I don't know, Korean, for example, then you'd watch Korean films, right? You'd watch Korean dramas, you'd listen to K-pop, you'd read Korean news, you'd basically immerse yourself into Korean culture. It's what I did just before university. I studied economics and finance, and I knew that the economics part of my degree was going to be far more difficult than the finance part of my degree. So I immersed myself into the world of economics. I watched YouTube videos on economics. I watched all the economics related documentaries that I could watch. I read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. I consumed as much material as I could from the founding fathers of economics back in the 18th century. And this approach set me up so well for when I started university, because I already knew the fundamentals of economics and I had a really strong foundation to then build on with the content of the lectures and the course material. It's a really powerful method because it's similar to how we learn languages, right? A baby doesn't actively try to learn how to talk. A baby doesn't try to learn the languages that its parents speak. It just happens naturally because they're surrounded with that language every day. So naturally they start to pick it up. And there have been so many studies that show just how using the immersion technique can be far more effective than using traditional revision techniques. So for example, a 2011 study at the Georgetown University Medical Center tested two groups of students. The first group were taught in the traditional classroom environment, whereas the second group used the immersion model. And the results showed that the students that were taught through immersion training processed information far better and were more engaged than the traditional classroom training. And as a bonus to using the immersion technique, it's just easier. It's more interesting watching documentaries and reading books and listening to podcasts than reading textbooks or reading lecture slides, right? It's a win-win. The mind map. Another useful strategy, especially if you're a visual learner. So mind mapping is where you use graphical ways to represent ideas and concepts that help you think visually, and they also help structure information to better analyze and understand it. Now, I'll be honest with you, I didn't use mind maps much at university because I'm not much of a visual learner, and mind mapping presents information in a visual way, so it just didn't work that well for me. But it's a great study method for people that learn and memorize things visually. And I have a friend that at university, where in his bedroom, one of his walls was covered in mind maps. He swore by mind maps, and he graduated with a 4.0 GPA, so they must have worked pretty well for him. And they also make studying that bit more interesting too. I mean, revision mostly consists of reading textbooks, reading notes, and writing out notes, but drawing out colorful mind maps is, I don't know, it's a bit more creative and more engaging than just reading a textbook, right? So if you've not tried drawing out mind maps, then give it a go. You might be surprised just how effective they can be. The Feynman Technique. This is another technique that I used a lot at university, and I'm not gonna go into too much depth on this because I talked about it quite a lot on this channel, and I go into even more depth in the Project Elon course. Alternatively, you can check out the video I made, one of my most watched videos actually, on how to study smarter, not harder, where I talk about the Feynman Technique more. You can click on the pop-up banner above, but in a nutshell, it's where you teach your course content to someone else. So whatever you're learning for your exam, whatever you're trying to memorize, you should be able to teach it using very simple vocabulary to someone that knows absolutely nothing about the topic that you're teaching them. So if you can explain the information in very simple terms, it means that you probably know the content pretty well. However, if you struggle to teach someone else the content in simple terminology, then you might have to go back and continue learning. But this method of teaching is really effective for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's a form of active recall. So when you're teaching someone, you're digging deep into your brain to find that knowledge, and you're strengthening those neural pathways. But secondly, you're essentially testing yourself and finding the gaps in your knowledge, which you can then go back and read upon later. So yeah, a super useful memory strategy that you can use that can save you a lot of time. The spacing effect. I can't make this video of memory hacks and not talk about spaced repetition. It was by far the most used study method that I used throughout university. I used it pretty much every single day for the entirety of my university education. Saying that though, I use loads of study methods, and I made a video and ranked them all on which study methods are the most effective and worth implementing into your strategy and which are pretty useless. You can click on the pop-up banner above to watch that video. So I'm one-on-one coaching right now a few dozen students in the Transform Your Grades in 30 Days course, and a lot of my students, when they first come to me, when the semester first starts, the number of hours studying they do will be relatively low. But as the semester progresses and their exams get closer and closer, the number of hours of studying will steadily increase. And then 1 or 2 weeks before the exam, their studying will suddenly increase even more as the pressure from the exams motivates them to start cramming in preparation. But it's just not studying smart. It's quite a stressful way of approaching your exams. And at least in my opinion, there is a better and smarter way of studying. If you space your studying out more, you can take advantage of the spacing effect. And the spaced repetition takes advantage of this. It's where you memorize some information and then a period of time later, maybe a couple of days or 1 week later, you come back to it and you reread it to reinforce it in your memory. So you're not learning the same material every day, or you're not studying the same material for 10 hours a day, but instead you have shorter study sessions that are spaced out over 3 or 4 day periods, for example. It's a really stress-free way of memorizing information, and I know it will help a lot of you because I know how stressed a lot of you get, especially just before exams, because you're not spending hours getting stressed out over why you're not able to memorize and retain your study material. Spaced repetition takes advantage of what is called the spacing effect, which was a phenomenon first identified by Hermann Ebbinghaus way back in 1885 in his book Memory: A Contribution to Experimental Psychology, which suggests that active recall with increasing time intervals helps the brain process and retain information. The whole point of this video is to try and get you to study less while achieving the same grades or even achieving higher grades. I have a whole video series on these kinds of videos. My latest video is how I schedule my daily routine to allow me to study smarter rather than harder. You can click on the video on the screen to watch that. It's actually one of my fastest growing videos right now. Alternatively, another video I made, how to graduate in the top 1%. You can click on the card on the screen, and whichever video you choose, I'll see you over there.